You must remember that at that time, the state government, the county government, the city government, all governments, local governments were under the control of Al Capone and his mob. They could not get convictions. You couldn't get juries who were brave enough to stand up to these people. Witnesses were subpoenaed, were appear, and they were murdered. Big problem in those days was staying alive, keeping the prosecutor alive as well as the witnesses.
Prohibition had corrupted the law. It was authorities' way to control its citizens. But in Chicago, it was Capone who controlled authority. Walter Trohan was on a story when he visited one of Chicago's police station houses.
I went up to the stairway and I was frisked by two men who halted me, took me, and felt to see if I had any revolvers, and I was indignant. I was a reporter. I was an important person, in my own opinion. And I went to the police captain and protested to Harrison. I said, "You're goons," I guess, words to that effect, frisked me as I was going up to the station. And the captain looked at me and said, "Those weren't my men. Those were Capone's bodyguards," which was an astounding thing to me, and I reported it. The fact that Capone not only went into the station, but his bodyguards frisked everybody who went up to be sure they weren't carrying a gun to shoot Capone.
Capone faced many assassination attempts. He always got away. By 1926, Capone had manipulated the Prohibition law, the gangs, and the police. All that was left was public opinion. He rarely let photographers take the scarred side of his face. The Prohibition Act had proved that a good image was a great cover for bad behavior. Prohibition made Capone an emperor. He ruled from his new palace, the Metropole Hotel in central Chicago. A little Caesar, his reign over the city had crossed national divides. It conquered and united disparate European communities. Prohibition had elevated Capone to wealth and respect. The outlawing of alcohol had taken him to the top. Just as Ford made Detroit, Capone made Chicago. He ate the industrialist. He employed the city.
When I came to Chicago, I had only $40 in my pocket. I went into business that was open and didn't do anybody any harm. Hundreds of young men, thanks to me, are getting from $150 to $200 a week.
He would go about in public and people would cheer, their benevolent city father. They would happily wave at the murderer. Capone courted their support. Tony Berardi covered the races for the Chicago Evening News.
Now, I used to like to bet a few dollars on a horse, and Al Capone and his bodyguards are walking by, and he says, "Hey, kid, how you doing?" I said, "I'm doing okay," because I made a few dollars. He says, "Why don't you bet on number 6? Now, I'm a racing form horse bettor. I looked at the racing form, and the horse that he mentioned, he only mentioned it by number. I looked at him, and he was a steeple horse. I said, "Oh, my God, how the hell could he win this race?" Well, in a horse race language, he opened up at 99 to 1, and then he was going down, and he went down to about the 60 to 1, and one of his bodyguards stuck a ticket in my pocket and walked away. I look at the ticket, and it's $5 win ticket on this number 6. Sure enough, number 6 won by a half a block. Paid, well, I got $322 for my for that $5.
He may have controlled the racetrack, but Capone wanted much more. Even as he was killing rivals on the streets, he was buying his most expensive status symbol, a new mayor, his mayor, Bill Thompson.
Al Capone spent $250,000 on Big Bill Thompson's second mayoral campaign. It was probably the best money that Capone ever spent because it bought him a great deal of political support and protection. Once Big Bill Thompson became mayor for his second term, he disappeared. He went hunting in Michigan and wasn't seen or heard from for months on end. So in effect, there was really nobody to run Chicago during this era except for the gangsters.
Thompson did little to mask his own anti-prohibition sympathies. He was even elected on a promise to be wetter than the Atlantic Ocean.
When Thompson died, they opened a safety deposit box, and I found $2 million in cash in bills in the safety deposit. This money was obviously illegitimate. It came from corrupt sources, or sources buying favors or receiving favors, such as the bringing alcohol into the loop by the Capone mob.
With the mayor under Capone's thumb, Chicago was completely clutched in the fist of the mob. But one man from Chicago he could not buy was America's Vice President, Charles Dawes. He pleaded with the nation to face up to the consequences of Prohibition.
They have created a super government in Chicago which is levying tribute upon citizens and enforcing collection by terrorizing, kidnapping, and assassinations. These alien outlaws have become fabulously rich as rum runners and bootleggers, working in collusion with the police and other officials, openly defying the Constitution of the United States.
Capone's empire had proved to America that the 18th Amendment was impossible to enforce. From its very beginning, there had been opposition to Prohibition, but the voice of the Drive movement was so strong, it hushed any murmurs against it. After 7 years, one of the whispers began to shout, the National Association Against the Prohibition Amendment. In 1927, they called a meeting in Washington. Some of America's most powerful men gathered, determined to break the law of prohibition. No law in the Constitution has ever been removed. The only solution was to fight for a new amendment, one to repeal prohibition.
It was utterly unthinkable that prohibition would ever be repealed. 2/3 of the Congress had voted for prohibition. Now 2/3 of the Congress would have to vote the other way. 44 states had voted for prohibition. Now they would almost all have to reverse that decision. For politicians to announce that they had been wrong and to reverse their position was a very difficult thing for them to do.
But the men who steered the association could not be intimidated by federal power. They were wealthy, influential company bosses like Henry Bourne Joy of the Packard Motor Company, Charles H. Sabin of the Guarantee Trust Company, and the chairman, Pierre DuPont, president of General Motors. Before Prohibition, he had supported the move for a dry America and had donated large sums to the Anti-Saloon League. A sober workforce he assumed would be an efficient workforce. But for 7 years, DuPont had watched Capone doing business and suffering no penalties. DuPont paid the enforcement taxes heaped on America's industrialists. Now he changed face. Repeal was right. The association launched an aggressive propaganda campaign. Prohibition was unconstitutional. It had stimulated crime, lost liquor tax, and cost a fortune to enforce. But most American voters felt that they had prospered during Prohibition. In 1928, they voted in a Republican government for a third term, and a new president, Herbert Hoover, who backed Prohibition.
Our country has undertaken a great social and economic experiment, noble in motive and far-reaching in purpose. It must be worked out constructively.
But in calling it an experiment, even Hoover recognized that Prohibition might be temporary. Hoover set up a commission to investigate its progress.
I propose to appoint a national commission for a searching investigation of the whole structure of our federal system of jurisprudence, to include the method of enforcement of the 18th Amendment and the causes of abuse under it. Its purpose will be to make such recommendations for the reorganization of the administration of federal laws and court procedure as may be found desirable.
To target Capone, Hoover appointed a new Attorney General for Chicago. His name was George Johnson. He vowed to put Capone behind bars. His son remembers the size of the task.
My father conceived the idea to go after Al Capone, Ralph Capone, Jack Gusick, and all these guys on violations of income tax. And I'm really sure that President Hoover encouraged my father to continue this very dangerous hunt.
Amassing enough evidence of Capone's financial dealings to get a tax evasion indictment was never going to be easy for Johnson. Gambling, vice, and bootlegging were all cash businesses, and Capone made sure his name was always 3 or 4 times removed from any actual operation.
I think my father had an absolute moral outrage against Al Capone. He was evil, but then he had this pretense of respectability, arrogance. He would try to do these good things for society. He tried to pose as Robin Hood. Well, of course, all this is very false. And this, I think, particularly annoyed my father and drove him on. My father conceived the idea of hiring some fresh talent, and he hired Elliot Ness practically out of college, University of Chicago, and 5 other agents at the time. He gave them the name, you're the Untouchables. Let's go get them, guys.
Ness raided Capone's liquor stills, but it would take the Untouchables over 3 years to find enough evidence to pin Capone down.